When I was 7 years old, my parents always had a hard time keeping track of me at home. It wasn't their fault though. We had a decent-sized property out in the countryside and I used to love exploring it. And when I figured out that I could hide and force my parents to come to look for me and practically make them play hide and seek, I became the most annoying kid in the world. That being said, that same annoying behavior is most likely what saved my life one evening on the farm. It was shortly after dinner toward the end of spring and the beginning of summer, so the sun was going down but it hadn't quite gotten dark yet. I decided that I was going to go play out in the yard for another hour or so, and I let my parents know that I was going out to play in the field. There wasn't really much to do out there, but my imagination helped me have a good time. I ended up heading toward the tree line to climb one of the trees that I like to spend time in, but as I got closer and closer, I started to get this strange feeling. I slowed my pace a bit and thought twice about climbing trees that night, and I'm thankful I did, because as I came to stop about 20 feet away from the trees, I saw a flicker of light. Even as a kid, I recognized the reflection of light off an animal's eyes, and growing up on the farm, my dad always told me to be on the lookout for coyotes. I locked eyes with whatever was in the woods staring back at me, and I was frozen in place. After a minute of neither of us making a move, I tried my best to slowly step backward and walk away from the tree line. But as soon as I took my first step, I heard the terrifying sound of what I now know are called yip howls. From the noise, I knew I was dealing with coyotes, and to make things even worse, it sounded like some of them were out in the field with me. As an adult, I've learned what you're supposed to do when you're in that sort of situation, but as a kid, once the fear set in, my adrenaline spiked and did the one thing you should never do. I turned and began running as fast as I could through the field. As soon as my back was to the tree line, I heard the yip howls again, with many of them being much closer to me this time. I was panicking as I sprinted through the field that was now bathed in moonlight. Tears were streaming down my face as the sound of the coyotes kept getting closer and closer, but I didn't seem any nearer to my house than I was before. To this day, I still don't know what caused me to change the direction that I was running in, but as the sounds of the coyotes got closer, I figured that maybe I would be safer in one of my hiding places. Luckily for me, there was a cluster of large rocks and boulders out in our field that we hadn't figured out how to get rid of, and I used to slide in between the really thin cracks and wedge myself inside when I was hiding from my mom and dad. And as I said, I didn't know what drew me to that spot, but as soon as I reached the cluster of boulders, I climbed over one, and as fast as I could, I stuffed myself inside one of the larger gaps. Only about 10 or 15 seconds went by before I heard the sound of quiet yipping and claws scratching on the ground as the pack of coyotes continued closing in on the rocks. I did my best to not make any noise when I heard them, but I knew that they were close enough to find me because I could hear the distinct sound of them sniffing the ground and the rocks around me. My heart was pounding, and I closed my eyes at the sound of claws hitting the top of one of the boulders that I was hiding behind. I wasn't foolish enough to look up, but I knew without a doubt there was a coyote right above me. I could hear the sound of it sniffing the rock growing closer and closer. I began to hyperventilate as I thought for sure that I was done. Thankfully, the next noise I heard was the sound of a gunshot. This caused the coyotes to scatter as another gunshot went off. After a moment, I heard my dad call out my name and I called back right away. He came right over to the rocks and pulled me out before the two of us safely made our way back to the house. I explained to my parents what happened, and my dad said when he fired his gun into the air, he couldn't see clearly, but he could make out at least 6 different coyotes sniffing around the rocks that I was hiding in. If he didn't find me, I surely would have been food for the pack that night. Growing up in the countryside, there isn't really much to do except wander around with your friends and do our best to stay out of trouble. For the most part, this meant doing a lot of hiking, camping, fishing, and working. One of our favorite places to go was actually one that we found when we were out hiking one of the trails about 20 minutes down the road from our town. On a hike one day, we decided to go off the beaten path and wandered through the woods for a bit and ended up finding an old broken down building that we just assumed was an old barn from the early 1900s. After finding the barn, we quickly turned it into our hangout spot, especially on nights that we wanted to camp out. It was really secluded, and because it was an enclosed space, it also felt sort of homely. That was until one night we showed up expecting to camp there, and we ended up running out of the woods in the pitch black, just hoping to escape with our lives. You see, we all decided to meet up after work, hang out, and have a little fire by the barn. It was probably around 10:30 that night when we made it to the trail, and we used our flashlights to find our way back to the barn, although by that point we could probably have walked to it with our eyes closed. We made it to the barn, and I told my buddy Nick to grab some wood to start the fire while I went into the barn and unpacked some of our stuff and waited for the rest of our friends. I walked into the barn, and I can't quite tell you what, but something was different about it. As soon as I stepped through the door, it was like I knew that someone had been in there. I quickly started to shine my flashlight around, but at first I didn't see anything, so I just shrugged off the feeling and walked inside. I placed our 2 bags on the floor and started taking out the electric lantern that we had inside the barn and placed it on the table. That was when I heard the sound of something shuffling around in the rafters behind me. I figured it was an animal, and since I wanted to get a good look at it, I turned around as fast as I could and shined the light up toward the ceiling, and what I saw made me drop my flashlight. When my light hit the rafters, I didn't see an animal, but instead I saw a full-grown man trying to hide in the shadows. But when he realized that I had seen him, he stopped trying to hide. As my flashlight fell to the ground, I let out a loud scream to let Nick know we weren't alone and quickly made a run for the barn door. I hardly made it outside when I heard the sound of the man dropping down from the rafters. Nick was standing outside the barn with wood in his hands when I told him to run. He waited for a second, but when he heard the sound of someone in the barn, he knew that I was serious, and we both ran as fast as we could back toward the trail. Nick still had his flashlight, but he ended up dropping it about halfway to the trail as he almost tripped over a large root. As we continued to run through the woods toward our cars, I could swear I heard the man from the barn chasing after us. Thankfully, we both made it to the cars in time and managed to get inside before anything happened. We each called one of our friends and told them not to go to the barn and ended up meeting at Nick's house to hang out for a few hours. After that night, we never went back to that barn, not even to grab our 2 bags. My older sister and I decided to move back into our family home in the countryside shortly after our mother passed away. We knew that we both wanted to sell it, but we figured that we should live in it for a little while before making our final decision. It was a bittersweet feeling being back in that place. While it was wonderful to be home, all of the memories of our family there and my mom being gone were one of the hardest feelings I ever had to deal with. I think that's why our first night there, we both decided to honor some of our mom and dad's traditions. For instance, we knew that every morning they would wake up early and sip their coffee on the back porch overlooking the field. It was their way of starting the day off right, at least that's what they used to tell us. So that next morning, we both set our alarm clocks for 6 a.m. and poured ourselves some coffee and sat outside in the fresh country air. The sun had just started to really come up and illuminate the sky, but there was a heavy fog that sat on the ground in front of us that limited our vision looking out into the field. My sister and I both sat there talking about our parents for a second, when all of a sudden I thought I saw something moving. It was out in the fields, but with mist covering them, which means I probably only could have been seeing about 20, maybe 30 feet ahead of us. I squinted my eyes to hopefully get a better look at whatever it was, but I couldn't make out anything other than a silhouette of something that looked like it was standing upright in the middle of the field. I looked over to my sister as I was going to point it out to her, but the expression on her face told me that this wasn't necessary. Her eyes were locked in the direction of the silhouette, and her mouth was slightly open. "What is that thing?" I asked her as I looked back to the field. Whatever it was, it looked like it had the stature of a person, but had to have been at least 10 to 15 feet tall. We were both in awe as it just stood there in the middle of the field. After a minute, we both agreed that it was probably just a scarecrow or something that our parents added to the field that we didn't know about. We figured that whatever it was, we would actually be able to see it once the sun fully came up and the fog cleared. We continued to watch it for a minute and then turned to talk to each other about something, and what really freaked us out was that when we looked back toward the field, the silhouette was gone. My sister and I were both equally confused about what we had just seen, but after a while we assumed that it had to just be some weird lighting effect in the haze, right? The two of us agreed to wake up the next morning around the same time and have coffee outside again. This time my eyes were locked on the field, and I don't think I'll ever be able to explain that intense feeling that came over me when I saw whatever that massive figure was once again. Only this time, both my sister and I saw the mysterious silhouette appear. It didn't come from the sides of the field though. It was almost as if it had risen out of the ground, but realistically it was most likely coming from the section of the field straight ahead of us, and what we were seeing was it becoming visible in the fog as it came forward. The two of us sat on the porch staring out into the foggy field for another 20 minutes or so, hoping to see where the silhouette runs off to. And as the mist began to clear, I was shocked to see whatever it was just turned around and walked back through the field. I told my sister that I wanted to go looking for it when it was a bit later, around noon, but she didn't want me to. She was very scared by this thing, whatever it was. And she even thought that our mom and dad always had coffee outside to watch the silhouette and make sure that whatever that thing was never made it up to the house. Later that day though, I decided to sneak out anyways and made my way out into the field. I walked over to where I was sure that the silhouette had been standing, but I didn't see any sign of tracks. The only thing I noticed was a strange feeling in my head. I tried to shake it off and I began walking deeper into the field. I probably made it about 10 steps away from where I had first gotten that strange feeling, when all of a sudden, everything went black. The next thing I knew, I was waking up inside the house on the living room couch. My sister said that she saw me passed out in the field and called a neighbor to help bring me inside. She asked if I needed to go to the hospital, but oddly enough, after waking up, I felt just fine. That was enough investigating for us though. After the 2 incidents with the silhouette in the fog and then passing out on the field, we decided to sell the house and move out as fast as we could. We left a note for the new homeowners to watch that back field, but other than that, we didn't want to sound like we had lost our marbles, so we kept everything else to ourselves.